Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. It's great to have you all here today. Hope everybody's doing well. I saw Audio Buff, you mentioned there's some a bunch of tornadoes in Oklahoma. A lot of hurting people today. Thanks for sharing, and hopefully we can, if there's anything we can do, we can. Thanks everyone else for joining here. It's great to have you all here. Hi, Keith. Red Frame Tech from the Netherlands. We have a pretty good contingent from the Netherlands today. It looks like I think Camille was here earlier. And yes, hoping you're okay. You're all okay there, Audio Buff. And prayers out to the victims there. All right, friends, let's jump in and take a look at, whoops. Okay, first thing, I'm operating solo today. Let me just get the right thing queued up here. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. So welcome. It's the 28th of April, 2024. As per usual, this is a workshop that goes along with our courses over at school.learnlightandsound.com. You don't have to buy the courses. You can sign up at the school for free, and if you want to be notified about these sessions, and then you can submit your questions ahead of time. And we do have some questions that were submitted ahead of time. A couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, Blackmagic Design introduced a new beta version 19 of DaVinci Resolve, which includes Fairlight. And we're going to take a look at some of those new features in Fairlight today, using our own audio files to kind of demonstrate how those new features work. And I know how, having worked in the industry for a while at software companies, typically companies will demonstrate their products when they're announcing them, and they'll probably use best case scenarios. So we're going to use our own scenarios here. Not that they're being dishonest or anything, but just that we're going to do some kind of feet on the ground, my own audio files, just to see how those features fare. And then we do have a couple of questions that were submitted ahead of time that we'll take a look at as well. All right. Okay, let's first of all, this is a beta. It's a 19.0 beta. I highly recommend you not move to this if you are in the middle of any projects that are important, especially paid projects, or put it on a computer that's not being used for the project. So just a warning there. I have found that I haven't had it crash on me yet, but in the work that I've done so far, I will say that there are some things that are a little slow, a little laggy, and I'm running on a pretty powerful Mac Studio here with the M1 Ultra chip. So it's and 128 gigabytes of RAM, I think. I'm not even sure, but it's a lot of RAM. So it's still a little rough around the edges. So let's talk specifically about some of these features here in Fairlight. And to do that, of course, what we need to do is switch on over to our Mac. So we're going to do that right now. And here we go. Okay. So I've put together a whole series of different tracks here. And the first thing I want to actually cover is, let's see here. I actually want to cover the music remixer first, which was kind of interesting. And this is different than what Adobe has done in Premiere and in Audition. So this is actually a little bit more of a, they mean mixer in a more traditional sense as opposed to what Adobe's doing. What Adobe's doing is actually allowing you to change the length of music or kind of chop it up into verses and get it closer to fitting your video cut. In the case of Resolve here, it's just taking the music and allowing you to either boost or remove certain instruments, if you will. So let me show you what I mean. So here is the music we're going to use. Just our intro music. You've heard that. Let's just make sure our fader's up. Good. Okay. Okay, so that's where we're starting. You probably just heard that. So the way we get to this is it's a track-based effect. So what we do is we click on the track itself, and then I'm going to come up here to the inspector, and we have our music remixer right up here. So I can turn that on, and if I want to see the kind of dedicated user interface, that's right here. And you'll notice it has it broken down into voice, drums, bass, guitar, and other. So obviously this is kind of aimed at a particular type of music is probably not so much orchestral music that you'd be using this for, but it is kind of interesting. And what it allows you to do is either mute one of those, and it will use some flavor of AI to actually try and remove that. And you could either cut or boost the guitars, cut or boost the bass, cut or boost the drums. And then there's this other category, which who knows what it's doing there. But let's try it out and see what happens. So what I'm going to do first is, let me just make sure. I'm going to put my fader back at 0. That was running a little bit quieter. And I'm going to go ahead and just play through it. Go ahead and play through it, and then I'm going to adjust the different controls here so that you can hear what they do. So here we go. That's actually pretty impressive, I'd say. I'm curious what you all think out there in the chat, but for the music remixer, that was better than I expected. Is it perfect? No. And granted, in this song, there's vocal chops, but not normal vocals. In other words, they're not singing words. They're kind of just using these vocal chops and kind of using that as another instrument, but it does recognize it as voice. Is it perfectly clean, especially when you push the dials to the max? No, but it is actually pretty interesting. Let's see what folks are saying here. Daniela says, are you aware that result is strange and muddy? I don't know if you're talking about the entire experience, but it can be... yeah, I mean, if you wanted to kind of just tune the sound a little bit, it seems to me like it would actually be useful. And we may not all, Daniela, be at the same level that you are with your Fairlight and your mixing skills, but I would say that this could actually potentially be useful, depending on the song that you're using. If you wanted to emphasize certain instruments here, you could really boost the drums if you wanted to. It was very good, actually, at identifying those. It looks like the synths were essentially what ended up on the other channel, according to the AI music remixer. So, in any case, that's looks pretty interesting. Sheriff Log says, that's stem separation. Fruity Loops Studio or FL Studio, DJ software and hardware have this feature. Absolutely. It's good to see it here over in DaVinci Resolve. Mark says, word of caution with 19. If you load existing 18.x projects into 19 and want to go back to 18.x, it will not load. That's a good point. So thanks for sharing that. Okay. Red Frame Tech, I've been using DaVinci Resolve 19 for a couple projects now, and it's been surprisingly stable so far. Good to hear. Okay. All right, Joe Mustang. Downloaded 19 beta, no problem so far. Mark says similar to music rebalance in RX10, indeed. So nice to have that as an option directly in DaVinci Resolve Studio. I believe these are all Studio, by the way, that we're going to be looking. Not all of them, but I think this one is Studio. So you have to have the paid version. Okay. All right, good. Now, so that's the first one. That is the music remixer. Let's actually go take a look next at the dialogue separator and see what that's about. So the idea here is that you can take dialogue and break it in, or you can take a recording that is meant to be dialogue and break it into 3 separate components. So there would be dialogue, there would be ambiance, and there would be background noise. And so let me go ahead and switch back over to the Mac here. We are going to take that music track and go ahead and mute that. And let's go down here to a clip we have. I'm going to go ahead and select the area here, the range, and we'll put it on repeat. So this is a track that we used, actually recorded quite some time ago, I think in 2021. Danny stood in this very reverberant stairwell, and it sounds like this.
Doing it, even though I wasn't baking a turkey this year, I still am used to getting up early and cooking something. I haven't baked a loaf of bread for probably, I'm not even sure how many years, but I wanted to make sure I used the jar of yeast that I sought out last year in 2020 before it goes bad. So we'll see how this loaf of...
Okay, so that's where we're starting. Not great, right? Obviously, you need to take better care during production if you can. But now as we select this track, I can go ahead and turn on the dialogue separator and pull up its user interface here. And you can see, as I mentioned before, you have now essentially faders for the voice, background, and ambiance. And I would think of ambiance as typically going to be things like reverberation or reflected sound. Background should be noises in the background. And then voice, of course, is the voice component. And ideally, I mean, if it's doing a really good job, we should be able to manage this pretty well. Now, this particular clip mostly has ambiance, so I'm not going to worry as much about background. We'll do another one where we actually look to manage some background sounds, especially some discontinuous background sounds. So let's start with this. I'm going to go ahead and get that back to here. And let's go ahead and play through and see what we get.
This morning I baked a loaf of bread. Apparently, even though I wasn't baking a turkey this year, I still am used to getting up early and cooking something. I haven't baked a loaf of bread for probably, I'm not even sure how many years, but I wanted to make sure I used the jar of yeast that I sought out last year in 2020 before it goes bad. So we'll see how this loaf of bread turns out. I baked it quite a long time with a water bath, and I think it'll be all right. So that's what I did this morning. Got up early, mixed up a bunch of ingredients, and made a loaf of bread.
Okay. So, okay. Perfect, no. Useful, but definitely potentially useful. And that's where I find that these kind of things can be really useful tools. And I just want to kind of underscore something here. Some people get so enthusiastic about AI that they are, I've heard people say, we don't have to worry about production anymore. And it's like, I'm not really feeling it that way. I think there's still some work to be done. I think these are useful tools and it will help. And I felt like in this particular case, I could use it to take the edge off of the ambiance, the reverberation. But if I pushed it really far, it definitely started to affect the dialogue itself. So it depends on what your, I guess what your standards or what your objectives are as far as your final audio. But I would say that for bigger projects, for bigger budgets, that the expectations will probably be a little bit higher than just slap this on a track, mute the ambiance, and move on with your life. It's it's not going to be that simple. Plenty of YouTubers will use it and think that it sounds amazing. And for their audiences, that may be all they need. They need the audience to be able to hear, and they're not trying to make something sound amazingly warm and beautiful. So that's kind of the distinction here as I'm thinking about it. So that was the dialogue separator for the reverb sample that we have. Let's go ahead and mute that. And then let's go ahead and head back over to the Mac so you can see what I'm doing here. That was that track. Let's come to this next track. Whoops. I have another track here that, go ahead and select that there. Let's go ahead and play this for you so you can hear where we're starting. All right, and here's another recording. This time what we're going to do is have a variety of things going. We've got the fan, of course, but we also have some phone ringtones. And let's try a couple different. And this is going to give us a sense for how things go with while I'm talking, and there's also the tone. There are a bunch of different tones that we're going with here, just so that you can get a sense for how well this does it. Okay, you get the idea. Let's go ahead and pull up. We'll go ahead and select the track, dialogue separator, bring that up, and let's go ahead and fiddle with this and see where we get. All right, and here's another recording. This time what we're going to do is have a variety of things going. We've got the fan, of course, but we also have some phone ringtones. And let's try a couple different. And this is going to give us a sense for how things go with while I'm talking, and there's also the tone. There are a bunch of different tones that we're going with here, just so that you can get a sense for how well this does at removing different tones. And go ahead and cut it there. See how voice isolation does with that. Okay. Curious, your thoughts in the chat? Let us know. This is one thought. AI and 32-bit float will fix everything, so the marketing department says. Not quite my thinking here. Even on this one, I think a judicious touch of this to make the background noise, especially those discontinuous phone ringtones, less imposing, I think could be the right call in certain circumstances. And I would say it's useful, but I would say you have to be very careful. Don't push it too hard. As soon as you start pushing it too hard, the plenty of artifacting on the dialogue itself. So again, I would call this one a useful tool, potentially in some such situations. Not a panacea, but very much a useful tool. So thank you, Blackmagic Design. I think you're making some good progress. That's very similar to the RX dialogue isolate, incidentally. So there's that. Okay, next one is the Ducker. The Ducker, let me go ahead and switch back over here. So the Ducker, the idea with a Ducker, of course, is essentially when music is playing in the background and there's dialogue, and you want the dialogue to be heard through the music. In other words, you don't want the dialogue and music to be competing so much with each other that everyone is struggling to hear what the dialogue is or what's being said. So that's what the Ducker does, is it takes that music and ducks it as the speech comes in, as the spoken word dialogue comes in. It ducks the music down, pulls it down some, and then vice versa. When the person stops talking, it boosts the audio or the music back up. So let's go ahead and show you where we're starting here. I'm going to unmute this dialogue track here called Ducker and the music remixer track. And let's go ahead and play that and see where we're starting. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another. Okay, that's a bit much. So here's how we can do this. On the dialogue track, I can come in, enable the Ducker, and I tell it the source. And in this case, we're going to choose the music. Actually, it's the inverse. I need to do this on the music track. So it's the music track that I want to duck. So I come to the music track. I'm going to turn off the remixer, and I'm going to turn on the Ducker. And the source is the Ducker track right here. So this is the dialogue on the Ducker track, and we're on the music track right now. We can go ahead and pull this up here as well. We have some parameters here. We've got the duck level, look ahead, rise time, hold, and recovery. And I think the default, I'm going to go ahead and reset this here. Let's just go with the default settings. So it's, I assume that this is ducking by 2.7 dB. So the idea here is that when I start talking, the music should decrease by 2.7 dB. It's looking ahead by 15 milliseconds. It's going to take 10 milliseconds to rise. It's going to hold for 150 milliseconds, and then when I stop talking, it will, well, when I stop talking, it will hold for 150 milliseconds, and then the recovery will take a total of 750 milliseconds. That's better part of a second. So let's go ahead and hear how this sounds. And I'm going to adjust the duck level in particular just to hear what that sounds like. So here we go. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Cut there. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. Okay, so it does kind of a little pumping here. I was finding in this particular case it might have made sense to use a longer hold time and a longer recovery time. But not bad. I think this is definitely useful. I felt like if you bumped it up into the 7 dB range, it was getting really obvious, in addition to the fact that I felt like you probably needed a longer hold and a longer recovery. But overall, pretty good. I did actually a mix 3 weeks ago or so for a voiceover that I did for an advertisement, and I actually used instead of using a ducker like this, I used, oh wait, I'm on the wrong screen. All right, my mistake. So here we go. So let me do that again. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the ducker, and we're going to run through that again. Apologies, people. Solo operation is risky. Here we go. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Cut there. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Cut there. Okay, now, that time you had the benefit of the visuals so you could see what I was doing. Apologies again for that. But it looks like we can dial things in. I had to really crank the hold and recovery up if I didn't want it to really sort of pump back in very quickly. There are different approaches here, obviously, and the approach I took on this mix that I did a couple weeks ago was actually kind of different. What I did is I did sidechain compression on the music, and so it's a different approach. Instead of ducking the music kind of universally, like the entire music track, and pulling its level down like you're pulling its fader down, with the sidechain compression, you're doing it on a much more quick, momentary basis. So essentially, you're putting a compressor on the music track, and you're putting a detector on the dialogue track, and every time I talk, it says, oh, he's talking. So then we do compression over on the music track. and it's a much more quick acting, so it's supposed to sound, it's a different sound than this. So this is more like what you'd see in traditional broadcast, maybe on a radio station back in the day when somebody was talking over music. This is kind of that approach, but lots of different ways you could do it. What I would recommend here, based on what we did here, is I would actually kind of crank the ducking level to something pretty prominent, and then tune the rest of these in, and then pull the ducking level back down. The reason I do that is it makes it very obvious when it's ducking, and you can kind of smooth things out like we were doing there. So that's that, and then once you've got that kind of smoothed out the way you want, and then kind of back off of the duck level, so you're not ducking quite so much, so many decibels, and that kind of got the results that I would expect there. So that's a look at that. Thomas asks an interesting question. When you select the ducked track, is DaVinci comparing the active track to the rest of the whole bus, or can you pick which track is your side chain? We missed that selection step. Yes, apologies. Let me go back and show that again. So if we come back over here, I selected the music track right here. I turned the ducker. Oh, yes, you're still not seeing it. We selected the music track right here. I come over into the inspector. I have the ducker turned on, and here's where you choose your source. Okay, and it's an individual track that you can choose, not a bus. So in our case here, we chose the ducker track, which is the track that has the dialogue on it to illustrate how the ducker works. So we are using this dialogue track right here called ducker to tell the music when to be ducked using the ducker here. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so ducker, potentially useful. Like it. Okay, what's next? Next feature here is the EQ. There's a couple of changes to the EQ, and the EQ in Fairlight, of course, has always been fine, good, but they've given us a few more options. Now we have a real-time analyzer, and we have high-pass curves. So let's go back over to the Mac here, and what I can do is let's go maybe with the dialogue track. Yeah, let's go with this. I'm going to go ahead and mute the music. We're not going to bother with that for now. And let's go ahead and pop into the EQ here for the dialogue track, which is A4 right here, dialogue. Okay, I just click right there. That opens up our EQ. And there are a couple things now. First of all, with this low pass, or this high pass, excuse me, and actually it also applies to the low pass up here at the top, but the high pass, now I can choose the steepness of the curve. So this is like 6 dB per octave, 12 dB per octave, 18 dB per octave, or 24 dB per octave. So that's a pretty nice thing. So in addition to setting the frequency, I can also choose how steep of a roll-off it is, which is pretty nice. Note that when you go with steeper roll-offs, you can start to affect the phase of your dial or your audio, in this case dialogue. So do be aware of that. So for example, many of you know that I often use the adaptive phase rotation in Isotope RX. If you are going to apply your EQ here, you can use that adaptive phase rotation to address any asymmetric waveforms you end up with, but you'll want to do that after applying this EQ here in DaVinci Resolve. So just to be aware of that. All right, now you'll also notice that when we play back, I'm going to go ahead and select this track, and we have its time selected as well. Notice that when I play back, we get a real-time analyzer right up in this area. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Cut there. Okay, so you saw we got a real-time analyzer, which can be helpful when you're EQing to kind of see how the audio is responding. The curves are interesting too. Notice that when we do the 6 dB per octave and I set it to 70, it's centered around 70. So just know that that frequency that you select is the center point. So it is going to be rolling things off higher than that. So you may have to set a lower frequency if you do want to use these more gentle slopes. So here, for example, when I go to 70, which is often where I'll set a high-pass filter, notice it's actually starting to roll off somewhere around 100. You're starting to get an effect there. So just be aware of that as you apply those different curves there. And the real-time analyzer, that's fantastic. Really, really useful. So there's the example of the equalizer, the new settings for both well, it's not a setting, but the real-time analyzer, and then the new high-pass curves there. So that's pretty cool. Okay, next up, we're going to take a look at sidechain compression. They covered this really fast in in the 2024 NAB update from Blackmagic. They had a lot to cover, obviously. It was like, I think it was a 2-hour stream or something like that, and DaVinci Resolve was just part of it. But they did mention at the very end, oh yeah, by the way, there's sidechain compression in our Dynamics processor. Okay, moving on. So they didn't spend a ton of time there, but let's just talk about that. So I was mentioning this a little bit earlier, and I can actually show you how this works here. So let's go ahead and turn the music back on. And I'm just making sure in the music track we have turned off the ducker, we've turned off the music remixer, we're good there. Okay. On the ducker track we've turned everything off, so that's good. Okay. So what I want to do here then is I want my music, I want to sidechain compress the music based on the dialogue here. So when I talk, I want the music to compete less with my voice. And the way I do that is I put a sidechain compressor on the music track up here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select this track, and I'm going to open up the Dynamics processor right here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and turn on the compressor, and we can choose our source. This is our sidechain source down here. So again, Ducker track is the name of the track that it has our dialogue on it. So we want to use that to detect when to compress, and then we'll go ahead and turn that on. Okay, now when I play this back, I can tune in my compressor settings so that the music is compressed as I'm talking, on a very instantaneous type of basis. So let's go ahead and play through and see how it sounds. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Cut there. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder, and I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact. Cut there. Okay, so you can see that's a very different sort of kind of sound versus the ducker. The ducker kind of brings the entire music down while you're talking and then brings it all back up a few moments after you stop talking, whereas a sidechain compressor actually keeps them both so that they're both very present, but compresses while you talk and then very quickly releases again so that the music is still very much present there. So a couple of different examples there. Obviously, I'd want to tune that in a little bit more. I still felt like I might actually change the release time to something faster. You have to be careful so you don't get a kind of really pumping sound on the music, but just spending some time with that and listening, you can get something pretty cool there. So that's sidechain compression. Now it's so much easier here, which is really nice. Really, I think that was a pretty intuitive implementation as well. And again, just to kind of run through that again, all you have to do is come to the track that you want to, let's go to the music track here. go to the track that I want to sidechain compress, choose the triggering track, in this case the dialogue track, which is Ducker. So I want the music to be compressed when the Ducker track is talking, if you will, and then I turn it on. And then I just set my compressor up however I need to do that to compress the music when I'm talking. Pretty cool. All right, so that's the sidechain compression. All right, let's go to the chat here and see what we have going on. Eric says sidechain is so cool. Absolutely, very useful tool. Mike says only listening for the most part today and didn't even notice. Prepping for new paint, scraping windowsills in the kitchen. Sunday multitasking. Love it. Get lots of stuff done. Oh, so Audio Buff. I've recently been using sidechain compression in live sound for certain mixing needs. Interesting. Would love to hear more about that, Audio Buff, and also hopefully your show that you just finished up went well for you as well. All right, we are missing Danny today. It's true. I'm missing her. We're all missing her. So she'll be back next week, hopefully. And Thomas, apologies for that. This is an exercise in visualization from the delivery doctor. Yes, indeed. There's something to be said. Yeah, you needed the visual so you could see what I was changing, but there is something to be said for just listening. I do feel like sometimes we spend too much time looking at our screens, and in fact, with digital mixing, that kind of changed the whole experience of mixing in many ways, because then we had these visualizations of what was happening, versus on the older analog equipment, you just kind of had these dials. You didn't have EQ curves like parametric equalizers that started showing exactly all this stuff. I mean, you had numbers, but you had to really use your ears to figure out, does that sound better? That was really what you were looking for. So there is something to be said. Not making excuses for bad video mixing. All right. Solo operation at its best. I'm sure Curtis will know. Sure enough. No question. All right. All right. Michael was talking, I think, here about the dialogue separation here. Quick turnarounds. If you do need to, quick turnaround, you got to do something fast. This could be really nice. All right. Daniel says, these new tools in Resolve 19 are not meant to be used by themselves. They are meant to be used in conjunction with the other tools in Resolve. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's part of the entire suite, so absolutely. All right. There we go on that. Good. Yeah, it's Christopher. Thanks for that. So there we go. Okay, cool. Mark also asked, do you ever scoop the music track EQ to reduce the dialogue frequencies? Sometimes, yes, but that's kind of a brute force approach because even when you stop talking, that EQ is still there, unless you use a dynamic EQ, which is another thing that you can sidechain specifically for when you have this kind of scenario with dialogue and music. That's actually a really, really useful way to do it. So instead of compressing the entire music track, you're compressing the targeted frequencies around where the dialogue is. So presumably somewhere, maybe centered around 1 kilohertz, you might apply a dynamic EQ with a really wide Q, and that way it makes room for the dialogue amidst the music. So that I think is a more elegant approach, but yeah, you can, if you've got to do something fast and quick, just a straight up EQ is another way to do that as well. Okay, we had a couple questions that were submitted ahead of time. Let's go to those, and then if you have any questions in the chat, go ahead and put those there with @CurtisJuddAudio. That'll make it really easy for me to find those. And let's go on the questions. So, there we go. Okay. First one was from Johan, and he says, how can you export individual audio tracks with track level effects applied? In my experience with Resolve, any EQ or dynamics applied on a track level gets disregarded when exporting tracks individually as stems. That is a great question, and let's go take a look at that right now. Thanks for the question, Johan. I'm going to go ahead and close this, the dynamics. Let's go ahead and turn that. Well, actually, let's go ahead and turn that off. I'm going to turn the compressor off, and we can leave that on there. Okay, cool. On the Ducker track, let's use the Ducker track to do this example here. So in short, Johan, the thing that you need to do is you actually need to bounce the track first and then export it. So bouncing it will actually bake in all of the settings, essentially everything you've done to mix it, to change it. So that's the first thing you'll want to do. So let's go ahead and I'm going to mute the music. All right, got everything muted except for the dialogue track here. Let's make a really obvious change to the dialogue track. I'm going to come into the EQ. As I play it back, I'm going to kind of tweak it around. So here's where we go. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. We're at 65 dB on the recorder. Here's without the EQ. I need to do another take. There was a weird mouth noise. Without EQ, it sounds like this. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty. And okay, so there's that. We also, what I can do, let me come back into that EQ. Whoops. Turn it back on. Come in there. I had to adjust it down by 4 dB. Let's go ahead and do that at the track level instead. Okay, so obvious. This will help us check if we did this right, if we actually got what we wanted. So here is the audio with that yucky EQ applied. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty. Okay, so what we do then is we select the track that we want to bounce. We'll go up to timeline, bounce selected tracks to new layer. So I'll just go like that. And there we go. Now we can play it back, and what I'll do here is I'll turn the EQ off so we're not applying it twice, and go ahead and put the fader back to where it was. Let's listen to it and see if we got what we wanted. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. Absolutely. There it is, that ugly, horrible sounding thing. Actually, although I'm not sure it applied the track fader. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. I don't know that it did that. So that's a good question. I don't know how to do that part, Johan, but in terms of the other effects, the dynamics, you can bake those in by bouncing the track. So good question. As far as getting stems out and actually applying those faders, I think you may... I'm not sure. So I think we should be able to come up here at this point, or actually right click on this one at this point. And let's go ahead and try this. Let's export this audio file. So we're going to give it the clip name, which is Ducker Bounce. It's been a couple weeks since I did this, so we just want the individual clip. We want to use only the selected track, and we want the selected range. We want to export with the clip level, clip fades, clip EQ and effects, and export. We need to choose where. That's going to go to our desktop. Okay. So let's go ahead and play that from our desktop. Desktop is here. And here it is. Let's just go ahead and play that out and see what it did. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, no. It muddled that up. That's interesting. So it is actually not taking the top layer there. Let's see if we actually move that. Whoops, I just accidentally grabbed that. Let's move this down to a new track. Mute the original one. Let's play this one back. So this should be the one that we applied the EQ to and bounced it. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. Okay, that's not it. Let's listen to this one. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find... Okay, so when I bounced it, it actually put it on a lower layer. So now if I select this right here, Now when I export this, this is what we should get. So let's go ahead and export this. And same thing, clip name. I'm going to overwrite in this case. Okay. And I think we are good to go. Export. Go back over to the Finder. Let's just make sure. I'm not sure that's the right one. Let's play it. It was easier to... That's not it. Why did it not export? Let's go here. Tedious, I know. Okay, let's actually just auto rename. That's going to put it on our desktop, give it the clip name, no normalization. Go back to the Finder. Oh, okay, here it is. It actually was here. So this should be the one with the nasty EQ on it. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know. No. You were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made... Johan, it's a great question. Short answer, I don't know the answer to that. Now you've challenged me, so looks like I need to find the answer. Great question. I don't know if you have to go to the Deliver tab to do it. I don't know. It's very odd. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. So I will save your question in my email that you sent me. I'll do some experimentation and I'll be in touch. All right. Good job stumping the chump, as they say. Next question from Dan. I have a DJI Mic 2 kit with 2 transmitters, 1 receiver to go along with my Osmo Pocket 3 and 1 Mic 2. The Mic 2 picks up a lot of ambient sound, especially when the host and guest are in close proximity. Before spending even more money on lav mics, do you think adding them to the 2 transmitters will allow for better sound? I.e., would they make it possible to have a host and guest sit close to one another without picking up each other's voices? Or is there a better way? Oh, you're working against the laws of physics, Dan. So here's the reality. The trick is this. When 2 people are sitting close, and I don't know what you mean by ambient sound, but it sounds like you're talking about microphone bleed primarily. When you have 2 people sitting close to each other, both have their own microphone. When person 1 talks, they are captured both in their microphone, but also in person 2's microphone. It's just because they're close to each other. The microphones built into the DJI Mic 2 are omnidirectional, lavalier style microphones. So the principle they work on, the way that they manage to not pick up everything is the fact that they're attached to the person. So that means the sound from behind is going to be picked up much less because there's this person between the microphone and the sound coming from the back. The sound of a person sitting next to them is still going to be picked up, but not quite as loud as it is going to pick up the person that's wearing it because the person wearing it is closer. Nevertheless, you're getting microphone bleed, and that is perfectly normal. There are two main ways to approach this. Number one, and it doesn't, I don't know how realistic each of these are for you. Number one is to do something in post-production to clean it up. For example, railroading. So if you're in a mix in DaVinci Resolve, for example, I could come back over here. If I say person 1 is talking, right here, and this is person 2's track, I might actually cut that part of person 2's track out so that we're no longer hearing their microphone bleed. We're not hearing person 1 talking to person 2's microphone because we cut person 2's microphone during that period when person 1 was talking. That's railroading. You can do a similar type thing with automation where you fade down the person who's not currently talking and keep the person who is talking with their fader up and vice versa. So you can do that in post-production. You can cross gates. You can use noise gates or noise expanders in post-production. That's another topic that's it's pretty involved. You can use, I suppose you could use a ducker. That'd be pretty choppy sounding, but maybe it's worth a try, like what we demonstrated here. The other option is to do it while recording, and to do that you need a device that does the recording that has an auto mix feature of some sort in it, and that's going to be things like a Mix Pre recorder, a Zoom F-Series recorder. Those have auto mix capabilities. So what those are doing is the exact same thing I just described in post-production, but they're doing it live while you're recording. And that is when person one talks, it takes person two's microphone and it reduces its level, essentially pulls its fader down, and vice versa. Then when person two talks, it pulls person one faders down, and back and forth and back and forth. So those are probably the two best ways I know of to address this. I don't think that buying additional lavalier microphones, if you're still going to have the people sitting right next to each other, is probably going to make much of a difference. So it's a fantastic question, but probably won't make a difference in terms of microphone bleed. So thanks for asking. And hopefully that helps and gives you some context for how to address that. All right. Going back to the chat here. So Mark, we're done with the questions that were submitted ahead of time. Mark mentions, wonder if you have to render the audio track to the new file. I didn't see that, but we'll come back to that, Mark. Hold that thought. But also, Christopher mentions, just on the topic of auto mixers, there are a couple of auto mixer plugins to do it in post. There's one called WT Auto Mixer. Thank you for bringing that up, Christopher. It's not the best sounding one, but it's worth a try. So you can, I think there's a free trial and you can try that, Dan. I don't know, Christopher, if you know of others other than WT Auto Mixer that you can use in post. If you just drop that in the chat, let us know. We'd be interested to hear about those as well. And then Christopher also says there are also cardioid lavalier microphones. They're a lot less common, but Shure Uniplex is one good example of that. In fact, I would say the Shure Uniplex is probably the best sounding one I've heard, although I don't know if that one's available with a 3.5 millimeter termination connector. But yeah, there are some cardioid lavalier microphones. Be careful, cardioid lavalier microphones, the traditional ones tend to sound pretty mid-rangey and not very great straight out of the recording, so you may have to EQ them some. The Uniplex is new because the Uniplex uses what's called a MEMS microphone module. It's actually basically kind of a microphone. It's a kind of microphone they have in mobile phones and other mobile devices. It's basically a microphone capsule, tiny microphone capsule, along with some circuitry right along with the capsule that does some processing, so they can kind of tune the sound without making a huge microphone capsule. The traditional cardioid lavaliers tended to be pretty large, so that's another thing to keep in mind. All right, coming back to Mark's note here. Oh, here's Dan. Okay, so appreciate the answer. Sounds like I should just pick up another dynamic mic. I do have a Mix Pre 6, but haven't used it yet. Well, either way, I mean, I think the best, easiest results, the quickest results, yeah, dynamic mics will help. But if people are literally shoulder to shoulder, there's still going to be some microphone bleed. Adding that Mix Assist plug-in to the Mix Pre can do wonders. As long as the people are close to their mics, that'll save a ton of time in post, so it's definitely worth it. Okay, Christopher says that Waves has an auto mix plugin of some sort. Well, they have Dugan, but I think it only works on certain consoles. It's not like a VST. Maybe there's another one as well. So thank you, Christopher. All right, back to Mark's question. Wonder if you have to render the audio track to the new file. We have a couple minutes. Let's go check. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but let's try. I don't know if there was maybe an option you saw there. So we have our track selected. We have the time range selected. We can go to timeline. Bounce selected tracks to new layer. I could bounce. I mean, I could do that. So I could say bounce the mix to a new track, mute everything except for the one I want to do. It's kind of a hack kind of thing. But let's try it. We'll go ahead and bounce it to a new track. Just like that. Okay. Okay, so it put it down here on audio 7. Let's listen to audio 7 and see how that sounds. I need to be quick on the fader in case. I'm going to start lower on the fader. We'll bring it up. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Okay, so that definitely baked in the EQ, and it seems like it baked in the fader as well. So now if I, let's go select this clip. Actually, let's time select it, and we've got the track selected. Right click. Let's go to export audio files. On the desktop, we're going to get the clip name, which is going to be bus 1 stereo blah blah blah. Okay, I just want this individual clip for the selected range. Use only the selected tracks. Okay, let's go ahead and try that. Let's pull up our Finder again. Finder again. There we go. Desktop. It should be this one right here. We should have a really yucky EQ applied. Let's hear. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to... Okay, so that was kind of our hacky solution, Johan. We muted everything, bounced the entire mix to a new track, and then exported that new track. So that is one way you could do it. And it looks like it also applied the fader changes as well when we did that. So that is one way to achieve what you were looking to achieve. I don't know if that's the only way. But if you're trying to export stems, that means you'd have to do it for each stem. So the music, dialogue effects. Anyway, there's an option there. Okay. Matt has an interesting thing. If both talkers were on Countrymen over the ear pointing the opposite way, that might help. Do you mean the people pointing the opposite way? Yeah, that could help. Or if they have it on if one of those ear-hung microphones and it comes around the cheek, if it doesn't come all the way out in front of them, wearing it on opposite ears, that could actually, you're right, that could help. Okay, another option here Mark mentions is you could go to the Deliver tab and render it as audio only. That's another way to do it as well. Yep. Cool, cool. All right. All right. All right. I think, Daniela, you're talking about something that I don't know exactly what this is, honestly. Can we arrange some initiative inside the Blackmagic forums, have the knowledge from the original Fairlight Evo, integration of the piano roll, and for music VSTs, we need urgent a multi-control. Okay. If you want to join the activism in the Blackmagic forums, there's some information there, Daniela. Thank you. Yeah, the Waves Auto Mixer is essentially an implementation for SoundGrid of the Dugan Auto Mixer, as I understand it. That's at least the last time I looked. So there is a way you can now run SoundGrid on a computer. It's pretty involved. Yeah, it's pretty involved, but it is an option out there as well. Okay. All right, friends. I also, one of the things I wanted to talk about too, I need to talk about this before we go. I did spend the week, my free time this week, looking into Dolby ATMOS mixing in DaVinci Resolve and started to also look at ambisonics. So ambisonics is a new thing here. I'm not ready to talk about it because I don't really have a lot to teach yet because I have a lot of questions myself that I'm still working out. I'm actually pretty enthused about Dolby ATMOS mixing, but I do not have a Dolby ATMOS speaker set up in this room. So I think typically what you're looking at is a 7-1-4 arrangement. So that is essentially a right and left, a center, that's 3, 2 sides, and then 2 rear surrounds, a low frequency effects, which is basically a subwoofer where you send the low frequency effects, plus 4 ceiling mounted, 2 in front, 2 in back, for a 714 Dolby mix. I believe you can also, the Dolby renderer from Dolby itself does have a binaural renderer in it. I don't know if you have to mix it out before you can do it, or if you can monitor in real time. That's not clear to me, but I haven't found a way to monitor binaurally from DaVinci Resolve when doing an Atmos mix. You can put it to stereo, but stereo and binaural are not exactly the same thing. So I'm still kind of trying to work through that whole thing, because what I'm trying to do is the simple question I'm trying to answer is, can you do a rough Atmos mix with headphones? And I think the answer is probably yes, but I don't know how to set that up just yet. And I didn't see a way here in DaVinci Resolve 19 to get to that. The binaural setting the Ambisonics version has a binaural monitoring option, but I haven't seen that for the Atmos part of it as well. So I'm going to see if I can get someone from Blackmagic to kind of describe how that works. So that's what's coming. I'm excited to learn more about that, and hopefully we can talk about that here in this. Okay. Christopher says, and this has been my experience too, Resolve doesn't do a native Ambisonics processor, correct? So you need a third-party plugin. In 19, they have added that. In fact, let me just show you here. Go ahead and pull that. Whoops. Let's pull this out of the way. If you go into the preferences under audio and video I/O, you can see there is now a new enable Ambisonics, and they have a specific Ambisonics spherical panner that you can use. So they do have Ambisonics support built in as in version 19 beta. So anyway, so that's where we're at. All right, friends. I think that's it for today. Hope you have a great week. Get out there and make some great sound, and we will talk to you again really soon. Take care.